Why, hello and welcome to Exhibitionista's Notes on Art. I am your host, Joanna Piar-Neves, and this is your Art Wonderment podcast. Why wonderment? Maybe to free yourself from the shackles of likes and dislikes. Liberate yourself. And today I have a very specific question in regards to liberation, actually, which is whether obscurity leads to creative freedom or not, and in reverse, if visibility can somehow hinder creative freedom or at least affect it or not. The reason why I thought of this idea of obscurity is very simple. It came from one single sentence of a book that hit me like a ton of bricks a decade ago. And I'm going to read you that sentence without telling you right away what the book is, but I'm going to reveal it very, very soon. So I have it here, and I'm going to read the sentence that inspired this episode from page 72. There's a reference to Gravity and Grace, and all you need to know here is that it is a film that the artist was trying to produce and get grants for. So here we go. This is the sentence. In the car, I started thinking, once I accept the failure of gravity and grace, it won't matter anymore what I do. Once you've accepted total obscurity, you may as well do what you want. And that's it. This is the sentence. The question of obscurity here is framed through the idea of acceptance. But what leads to it? In our heteronormative societies, maybe the elder son is fated to visibility and all the others to obscurity. A beautiful woman is fated to visibility, whereas women who are not conventionally beautiful maybe are fated to some sort of obscurity. So here, for an artist, a white woman who has access to grants, so ways to finance her projects, but not really wealth that she may tap into to produce it on her own, she finds herself in artistic darkness, in obscurity. And so here obscurity feels, at least in the way she describes it, like going back to a sort of original state, a place where nothing was expected of her. But why? So this page 72 sentence came from a book called I Love Dick by the author, American author, Chris Kraus, so female white author. It was published in 1997 and it sold not more than a few hundred copies. But then when it was republished in 2006, it was received with great acclaim, hailed as even the most important feminist book of the last decades. It was published, this book, by an obscure author. It became very quickly an obscure book, and suddenly everything shifted completely. It is now the book for which the author, Chris Kraus, is the most famous for, and which kind of granted her, I would say, a sort of avant-garde or obscure national treasure status in the US and a place in the feminist pantheon. I picked it up from a table at Waterstones. So just to tell you how much sometimes these moments are strong, I didn't read a single sentence from it, read the title, this kind of mesmerizing, strange, and sort of infantile provocation almost of naming a book I Love Dick. But then the cover made the book seem sort of sober, and so in some sort of way it's a very minimal title and sort of self-possessed, and I was immediately tempted to pick it up and take it home, and I wasn't disappointed. The cover was made by Hedy L. Colty, and so this is the Serpent Tales cover that I have, so I'm showing it to the camera for those who are watching, and it is really minimal. It is attractive. There's these moments in culture where suddenly there is something in us that makes us, or that drives us to a particular cultural piece. So Chris Kraus is a female author born in New York in 1955, but then she and her family moved to New Zealand, and that's where she grew up. Then she spent some time in London, went back to New York, where she developed a sort of avant-garde work. She was, for a time, the assistant of Louise Bourgeois, the famous French artist who lived most of her life in New York in the US. She worked on film, experimental mostly, until Gravity and Grace, which is referred to in the passage that I read to you, and which comes up quite often in the book. It is really a sort of biographical line that is important for Chris Kraus. And this book, I Love Dick, also marks a shifting moment in her career. So in the 80s, she meets an intellectual called Sylvère Lotringer, or Sylvère Lotringer, as he is called in New York, where he is living. And so he was a prominent intellectual with a publishing house called Semiotext, and she starts working with him as an editor. They work together, they live together, they become a couple. Not all couples can work together, and not all of them can share an intellectual life, career, private life, a sexual life. And the book, I Love Dick, is going to be very much about it. So the reason why I'm talking about Sylvère Lotringer is not because once we are doing a biographic moment or description of an author, we must immediately revert to their spouse. It's more because Sylvère is going to be very central person in this book, as you will find out. So he was a character. He was born in 38, so he was older than her, and he wrote his dissertation on Virginia Woolf. He was still in France. That dissertation was supervised by Roland Barthes and Lucien Goldman. So he ends up pals with Leonard Woolf, who was the husband of Virginia Woolf. He interviews Vita Sackville West. He interviews T.S. Eliot. I mean, he is in a very specific moment of culture, of Western culture, European culture, and then he moves to New York, and he is also embedded and contributing also through his publishing house, a little bit like Virginia Woolf and Leonard, to the culture. He worked as a professor as well. And he influenced the work of students of his, such as Catherine Bigelow, Marshall Blonsky, art critics Tim Griffin and John Kelsey, and the poet Ariana Reines, for example. So another trait of Sylvère Lotringer is that he appears as a quasi-fictional character in quite a few books. So Kathy Acker's Great Expectations and My Mother, Demonology, in I Love Dick, as you will see, in Alien and Anorexia, another of Chris Kraus's books, and in Torpor, the final of this trilogy, Chris Kraus's trilogy, and in Eileen Miles's Inferno. So Lotringer is a figure, let's put it that way, whereas Chris Kraus, in this moment of her life in the 90s, so this book was published in 1997, is not. She is the wife of Sylvère Lotringer, and that is going to be an important aspect of I Love Dick. So the narrator of I Love Dick is Chris herself, but between the first and the third person, because she speaks in her own voice, but she also speaks of herself. The husband of the story is her ex-husband, Sylvère Lotringer. They separated in 2005, and Dick, so the Dick of the title, is a real academic, so a real person that really existed and exists still. So Chris, the person, the real person, and Chris, the narrator, both find themselves in Dick's home with Sylvère. That's the beginning of the book. She becomes infatuated with Dick, and as any normal person would do, she tells her husband, obviously, and it becomes the topic of conversation, a big, big part of their lives. So I'm going to read the very first pages of the book. December 3, 1994. Chris Kraus, 39-year-old experimental filmmaker, and Sylvère Lotringer, a 56-year-old college professor from New York, have dinner with Dick, a friendly acquaintance of Sylvère's, at a sushi bar in Pasadena. Dick is an English cultural critic who's recently relocated from Melbourne to Los Angeles. Chris and Sylvère have spent Sylvère's sabbatical at a cabin in Crestline, a small town in the San Bernardino Mountains, some 90 minutes from Los Angeles. Since Sylvère begins teaching again in January, they will soon be returning to New York. Over dinner, the two men discuss recent trends in postmodern critical theory, and Chris, who is no intellectual, notices Dick making continual eye contact with her. Dick's attention makes her feel powerful, and when the check comes, she takes out her Diners Club card. "Please," she says, "let me pay." The radio predicts snow on the San Bernardino highway. Dick generously invites them both to spend the night at his home in the Antelope Valley Desert, some 30 miles away. Chris wants to separate herself from her coupleness, so she sells Sylvère on the thrill of riding on Dick's magnificent vintage Thunderbird convertible. Sylvère, who doesn't know a T-bird from a hummingbird and doesn't care, agrees, bemused. Done. Dick gives her copious, concerned directions. "Don't worry," she interrupts, flashing hair and smiles. "I'll tail you." And she does. Slightly buzzed and keeping the accelerator of her pickup truck steady, she's reminded of a performance she did called Car Chase at the St. Mark's Poetry Project in New York when she was 23. She and her friend Liza Martin had tailed the steelily good-looking driver of a Porsche all the way through Connecticut on Highway 95. Finally, he'd pulled over to a rest stop, but when Liza and Chris got out, he drove off. The performance ended with Liza accidentally, but really, stabbing Chris's hand on stage with a kitchen knife. Blood flowed, and everyone found Liza dazzlingly sexy and dangerous and beautiful. Liza, belly popping out of a fuzzy midriff top, fishnet legs tearing up against her green vinyl miniskirt as she rocked back to show her crotch, looked like the cheapest kind of whore. A star is born. No one at the show that night had found Chris's pale, anemic looks and piercing gaze remotely endearing. Could anyone? It was a question that had temporarily been shelved, but now it was a whole new world. The request line on 92.3, The Beat, was thumping. Post-riot Los Angeles, a city strung on fiber-optic nerves. Dick's Thunderbird was always somewhere in her line of sight, the two vehicles strung invisibly together across the concrete riverbed of highway like John Donne's eyeballs. And this time, Chris was alone. Back at Dick's, the night unfolds like the boozy Christmas Eve in Éric Rohmer's film My Night at Maud's. Chris notices that Dick is flirting with her, his vast intelligence straining beyond the pomo rhetoric and words to evince some essential loneliness that only he and she can share. Chris giddily responds. At 2 a.m., Dick plays them a video of himself dressed as Johnny Cash, commissioned by English public television. He's talking about earthquakes and upheaval, and his restless longing for a place called home. Chris's response to Dick's video, though she does not articulate it at the time, is complex. As an artist, she finds Dick's work hopelessly naive. Yet, she is a lover of certain kinds of bad art which offers a transparency into the hopes and desires of the person who made it. Bad art makes the viewer much more active. Years later, Chris would realize that her fondness for bad art is exactly like Jane Eyre's attraction to Rochester, a mean horse-faced junkie. Bad characters invite invention. But Chris keeps these thoughts to herself, because she does not express herself in theoretical language. No one expects too much from her, and she is used to tripping out on layers of complexity in total silence. Chris's unarticulated double flip on Dick's video draws her even closer to him. She dreams about him all night long. But when Chris and Sylvère wake up on the sofa bed the next morning, Dick is gone. Obscurity here appears first as the physique of the author. She describes herself very often in critical terms, so negatively, with expressions such as pale, anemic looks, never the type for cowboy guys, unseductive. She seems to be a character that is not able to seduce the visible men, the cowboy guys, those who have, through their looks, through their power, or through just the fact that society expects it from them, visibility. So, in I Love Dick, there is a triangle. We have just heard it form in the beginning of the book. That's how it starts, with a sort of love/sex/lust/desire triangle. There are money issues. There is sex, or lack thereof. And finally, there are deep musings about art, namely about the American artist Hannah Wilke. But the structure of the book is very interesting. It's epistolary. It is also diaristic, but it also contains transcriptions of phone calls or of recordings, of voice messages. The plot of the book is obviously a plot that attracts attention. It is adulterous desire, routine, and married life. This is not only a couple that existed in real life, fictionalized, but the couple itself is an intellectual couple. And so they are too intelligent to embark on deceit. They talk openly about a desire for someone outside of the couple. So this man named Dick, this sort of cowboy figure who is also a professor, and they start strategizing together about how to handle that infatuation. And before you say anything, and before you think anything, there is absolutely nothing that you can refer to that they haven't already, either specifically or subreptitiously in the narrative. Marcel Proust, Jane Austen, Madame de Lafayette, of course, the roman à clé. Why am I saying this? Not to frustrate you, but to describe the way these people think, but also the context that serves as the setting of this novel, of this book. So as their biographies described very well, there is a real interaction with the works that make up the culture of the 90s, the cultural filters that are used to evaluate the situation, but also that are used to create the situation. It is a really playful book where the rules are set out from other rules that were set out in literature as opposed to real life. And so the friction between real life, literature, fiction, documentation, recording, and assessment and memory is fascinating in this book. So on page 27, Sylvère Lotringer ends up by describing pretty much what this is in a PS to Dick, because they start writing to Dick, not really sending the letters, but they start a sort of epistolary relationship with him, unbeknownst to him, and also not really acted upon. So Sylvère writes a PS at the end of his letter. PS. Thinking about it further, these letters seem to open up a new genre, something in between cultural criticism and fiction. You told us how you hope to revamp the writing program at your institution along these lines. Would you like me to read from it in my critical studies seminar when I visit next March? It seems to be a step towards the kind of confrontational performing art that you're encouraging. Regards, Sylvère. So this is what happens. They start talking about this situation, this infatuation, and they start frantically writing to Dick. But again, they don't send the letters, at least in the beginning. So the tone. It is, to me, wide-eyed sadness, which is another way to describe pure, unadulterated comedy. This book is funny. See for yourselves and hear for yourselves how funny and how immensely explorative these letters are, but also what kind of triangle is created here and how they relate to Dick. Crestline, California, December 10th, 1994. Dear Dick, on December 15, I'll be leaving Crestline to drive our pickup truck and personal belongings on our miniature wire-haired dash-hand Mimi back to New York. 6 or 7 days, 3,000 miles. I will drive across America thinking of you. The Idaho Potato Museum, every landmark that I pass, will draw me closer to the next, and they'll all be meaningful and alive, because they'll trigger different thoughts of you. We will do this trip together. I will never be alone. Love, Chris. Crestline, California, December 10th, 1994. Dear Dick, I bet if you could have done this with Jane, you never would have broken up with her, right? Do you envy our perversity? You're so priggish and judgmental, but deep down, I bet you'd like to be like us. Don't you wish you had someone else to do it with? Your friend, Sylvère. Dear Dick, come to think of it, why did you even call us Sunday night? The night after our date with you in Antelope Valley? You were supposed to be this cool guy smoking a cigarette behind his bedroom door on Sunday morning, just waiting for us to clear out. It would have been totally in character not to call. So why did you call? Because you really wanted it to continue, right? You came up with this lame excuse about going to get breakfast at 7:30 in the morning in this tiny town where the grocery store is 3 minutes away. It took you 3 hours, Dick, to get that fucking breakfast. So where'd you go? Did you sneak out to meet the bimbo girl who left her abject message on your answering machine? Can't you spend a single night alone? Or were you already fighting the invasion of your mental universe by this couple of cynical, rapacious libertines? Were you trying to defend yourself? Or was it a trap you set, tightening it the following night with your apparently innocent call? Actually, that night I picked up the receiver for a moment and heard your voice. Such a small voice, too, for such enormous stakes. You've been holding our destiny in your hands for the last few days. No wonder Chris didn't know what to say. So what's your game, Dick? You've gone too far into it to keep hiding in the distance, biting your nails and listening to some girls or some other girls. You have to deal with what you've created. Dick, you have to respond to the following facts. Dear Dick, I think you won. I'm totally obsessed with you. Chris will be driving across America. We have to talk this over. Sylvère. So this goes on and on and on and on. They write letters, and as you can see, there's a sort of a crescendo. They start effabulating, they start projecting, and at a certain point, they think we should send these letters. They almost do, then they don't. They wrote about 80 pages altogether, the both of them. So they decide that maybe instead of a book, they could produce a sort of avant-garde experimental video where they bring these texts and they pin them on the car, on the cactuses. In the excerpts that I read, you learn that Dick called the day after, and Sylvère has also engaged in a few conversations with him over the phone with the pretext of doing something together academically. So then they decide that they have to do something about this. And they figure out that maybe the best thing to do is to call Dick, tell him about the infatuation, the writing, and propose an idea of an experimental video. Dick says he needs to think about it, and so they decide to send a fax to his house. But what happens is that Chris, and up to this point, all of it had been organic together. It had been a sort of a collaborative effort to explore this triangle and all its possibilities, except the physical encounter. And it's interesting to see that in this writing, for Sylvère, it's always more important that the physical encounter hasn't taken place and that they went beyond it in some ways, and that it has become something, a sort of a, I think he calls it a meta fuck at some point. And for Chris, there is a sort of volatility in regards to the physical encounter until the moment the fax is sent. And so this has become a reality. She starts to feel some sort of trepidation, but also desire. And therefore, she decides to send a secret fax. She writes it, but at the moment of sending it, she changes her mind and doesn't do it. But she does tell Sylvère about it. And therefore, on page 50, we are already in the situation of the betrayal without any physical encounter. The betrayal arrives in fictional form, but this fictional form comes with real feelings. But the triangle here may very well be between Sylvère, Chris, and us. They specifically mention at a certain point Sophie Calle, who is a French artist whose career was dedicated to fictionalize her own life and her own identity. In one of her first works, Sophie Calle asked her mother to hire a private detective to follow her. So she didn't know whether she was being followed at a certain moment in the day. She had no idea, but she knew that someone would be following her at some point. And therefore, this artifice, because of course it was created by her, no one was really interested in knowing about her life, not even herself, was intersecting with life, but it was a fictional device. And therefore, fiction creates a sort of framework that renders life fictional, or at least that intersects with it. There's a passage in the book where Sophie Calle is referred to, particularly in regards to fiction and in regards to another writer. And this artifice of fiction intersecting with life here is gendered. And Chris Kraus is very adamant in showing the difference between her own device and Sophie Calle's device and the device used by male authors. So I'm going to read you the passage where she mentions Paul Auster and Sophie Calle. Because most serious fiction still involves the fullest possible expression of a single person's subjectivity, it's considered crass and amateurish not to fictionalize the supporting cast of characters, changing names and insignificant features of their identities. The serious contemporary hetero-male novel is a thinly veiled story of me, as voraciously consumptive as all of patriarchy. While the hero/anti-hero explicitly is the author, everybody else is reduced to characters. Example: the artist Sophie Calle appears in Paul Auster's book Leviathan in the role of the writer's girlfriend. Quote, Maria was far from beautiful, but there was an intensity in her grey eyes that attracted me, unquote. Maria's work is identical to Calle's most famous pieces, the address book, hotel photos, etc. But in Leviathan, she's a waif-like creature, relieved of complications like ambition or career. When women try to pierce this false conceit by naming names because our eyes are changing as we meet other eyes, we're called bitches, libellers, pornographers, and amateurs. Why are you so angry? He said to me. There are no messages from Dick that evening on the answering machine. The house is empty, clean. After dinner, Sylvère and Chris sit together on the floor and turn the laptop on. In male fiction, the author or the author/main character is usually either a hero or an anti-hero who basically is also a hero because there is something desirable. There is a process of identification that occurs. Whereas here, there's something about this character that is more than unlikable. She actually is described at a certain point, or they describe themselves as unlikable characters. But it's more than that. She is not a dignified person, and unlikable characters seem to have been a sort of feminist revolution. One of the people who, when this book was published, re-edited, who loved it was Lena Dunham, who is famous for having created the show Girls, for acting in it, for being naked in it without a perfect body, and this claim of the unlikable character for themselves, the female writers and filmmakers, is something that is considered to be part of current or at least very recent feminism. But here, what is really interesting is the complexity of this unlikability. It goes very, very far. There is real humiliation that is not presented in an S&M framing. There's no desire from the author of creating a relationship with the reader that would be of identification. And that's the real difference, and I think the real transgression of this story. And also that the fiction presenting a sexual fantasy discussed, collaboratively strategized as being true love. Although they don't have sex, sex has become somewhat of a fictional device. Desire and lust have become fictional triggers, and the real relationship is preserved behind the fiction. And that's the real transgression. We don't know who this couple is. Everything is revealed. And yet, the performative, consciously performative act of writing, editing, and publishing this book is a curtain that is absolutely opaque. So I'm going to illustrate this notion of life being affected by fiction by reading Exhibit D, where Sylvère and Chris converse through simultaneous transcription. So here goes. Sunday, December 11, 1994, 12:05 p.m. C. Sylvère, what are we going to do if he doesn't call? Are we going to call him? S. No, we can continue this without him anyway. C. But you're forgetting that I really want for him to call. I'm tingling all over, waiting for the phone to ring. I'll be really disappointed if he doesn't call. S. Well, this time you should talk to him. Why let us two white guys decide the course? I got him in. It's your turn now. C. But I'm afraid he's going to not call at all. What then? Do I call him? It's already feeling like the Frank Zappa song, You Didn't Try and Call Me. S. He'll call, but not today. He'll call when it's too late. C. Oh, Sylvère, I hate that. S. But Chris, that's why he'll do it that way. C. If he doesn't call today, I think I'll have to disengage. Because, I'll lose respect. We've done so much. All he has to do is call. S. But maybe he'll realize we've already done everything in his place. Why disturb it? C. I disagree. He should be curious. If someone called me and said they'd written 50, 60, 70 pages about me overnight, I'd definitely be curious. Sylvère, I think if this whole dick thing falls through, I'll go to Guatemala City. I have to do something with my life. S. But Chris, the Antelope Valley is Guatemala. C. I'll just be so disappointed if he doesn't call. How can you continue loving someone who doesn't pass this first and really basic test? S. What test? The adultery test. C. No. The first test is to call. Since their telephone has call waiting, Chris phones her unshockable friend Ann Rauer in New York. 10 minutes later. S. So what did Ann think? C. Ann thought it was a great project, more perverse than just having an affair. She thinks it'd make a good book. When Dick calls, shall we tell him we're considering publication? S. No, the murder hasn't happened yet. Desire is still unconsummated. Let the media wait. C, whining. Why? 7 hours later. C, look, Sylvère, this is hopeless. We're leaving in 2 days, and I can't think past this phone call. I got a fax this afternoon from a producer who wants to see my film. I didn't even read it. Maybe it's already thrown away. Pause. It's an impossible situation. I don't even know what I want from Dick anymore. Nothing good can come of this. The only thing I'm thankful for is that it's not the 70s and I didn't already fuck him. You know that anguish? Waiting by the phone until the burn and torment finally goes away. Our only hope is for some resumption of our normal lives. What seemed so daring just looks juvenile and pathetic. S. Chris, I already told you he wouldn't call. He has a tendency to pull away. We've taken the decision for him, deciding on his thoughts. Remember the introduction that we wrote for him? In a sense, Dick isn't necessary. He has more to say by not saying anything, and maybe he's aware of it. We've been treating Dick like a dumb cunt. Why should he be like it? By not calling, he's playing right into his role. See, you're wrong. Dick's response has nothing to do with character. It's the situation. This reminds me of something that happened when I was 11 years old. There was this man at the local station who'd been very nice to me. He let me talk over the air. Then one day, a cloud came over me. I started throwing rocks into the windshield of his car. It made sense while I was doing it, but later I felt crazy and ashamed. S. Do you want to throw a rock through Dick's Thunderbird? C. I already have, though mostly I've debased myself. S. No. C. Of course. I've projected a total fantasy onto an unsuspecting person and then actually asked him to respond. S. But Chris, I think his embarrassment isn't in relation to you or me, but to himself. What can he do? C. I hate being thrown into such a physical state. When the phone rang during dinner, my face flushed, my heart was pounding. Laura and Elizabeth drove all this way to visit us, and I liked them, but I couldn't wait for them to leave. S. Isn't that experiencing life to the hilt? C. No, it's just a dumb infatuation. I'm so ashamed. S. But even if his silence hurts you, isn't that what attracted you to him? The fact that he was inaccessible? So I think there is a contradiction there, at least nothing to feel ashamed of. C. I took terrible liberties with another person. He has every right to laugh at me. S. I doubt he's laughing, perhaps biting his fingers. C. I feel so teenage. When you're living so intensely in your head, you actually believe when something happens you've imagined that you caused it. When Leonora OD'd on bad acid from my boyfriend Donald, he and Paul and I sat up all night in the park and made a pact that if Leonora wasn't out of Ward 16 tomorrow, we'd kill ourselves. When you're living so intensely in your head, there isn't any difference between what you imagine and what actually takes place. Therefore, you're both omnipotent and powerless. S. You're saying teenagers aren't in their heads? C. No, they're so far in that there's no difference between the inside of their heads and the world. S. So what's happening in Dick's head now? C. Oh, Sylvère, he's not a teenager. He's not experiencing any feeling of infatuation for me. He's in a normal state, well, whatever's normal for him, wondering how to deal with this terrible, mawkish situation. S. If he's thinking about it, he'll call tonight. If not, he'll call on Tuesday morning. But he will definitely call. C. Sylvère, this is like the Institute of Emotional Research. Yes. It's funny how what we're after is so fleeting and so easily lost. The only way we can recapture any feeling is by evoking Dick. C. He's our imaginary friend. S. Do we need that? It's so mixed up. At times we reach these peaks of real possession at his expense, but through it, we're able to see him more clearly than he would ever himself. C. Don't be so presumptuous. You keep talking about Dick as if he was your little brother. You think you have his number. S. Well, I don't have the same take on him as you do. C. I don't have a take. I'm in love with him. S. It's so unfair. What has he done to deserve this? C. Don't you think we're doing this because we're anxious and confused about leaving California? S. No, leaving's our routine. But what would have happened if he'd been involved and willing? C. I would have fucked him once and then he'd never call. S. But what makes all of this legitimate is that you didn't. What thinking about it's brought up is the essential thing. You know, I was picturing Dick before as a wicked, manipulative creature, but perhaps he's keeping silence just to give us time. C. To get over him. He wants us to get over him. S. Chris, what sort of strange zone are we entering? To write to him is one thing, but now we're writing to each other. Has Dick been a means of getting us to talk, not to each other, but to something? C. You mean that Dick is God? S. No, maybe Dick never existed. C. Sylvère, I think we're entering the post-mortem elegiac form right now. S. No, we're just waiting for his call. 8:45 p.m. S. It's so unfair. I guess these silent types make you work twice as hard, and then you can't escape because you yourself create the cage. Maybe that's why you feel so bad. It's like he's watching you do this to yourself. Okay, so as I told you in the beginning, there are other issues and there are other references that come up. And one of, I guess, the ghosts that haunt this book is Jane Austen, because Chris Kraus talks about obscurity in economic terms. So, as I said before, after the triangle come the money issues. That's something that's introduced right at the beginning. But the reason why I talked about the triangle is that because in the book, Chris, as an author, makes it about two men. So she is under the weight of her husband, who is an incredibly famous scholar, and another man who is kind of his doppelganger in a sort of masculine or uber masculine version. And she's crushing under the weight of the ghost of all those men in the past who would not be seduced by her and who would not consider her attractive. But the economic angle is really important as well for obscurity. So the money issues, and here I will just say, I don't know why Jane Austen, her books are about the obscurity of women and how money is the trigger or the device, the literary device, but really the life device that brings women to visibility for a moment, at least in fiction, but certainly not in real life. And therefore, what is possible in Jane Austen's novels is for the invisible character to be visible through wit or beauty, and then to rise in class and status, and then to serve her husband's visibility through her obscurity. In the case of Chris Kraus, she is in a world where women can aspire to be visible, or at least can aspire to be authors, and to have their work come into the platform of visibility that is contemporary art and its system. So on page 16, there is the first reference to money. Sylvère never dreamed and rarely knew what he was feeling, so they played a game sometimes that they devised to tease his feelings out, objective correlative. Who was Sylvère's metonymic mirror? A student at the art school, their dog, the Dart Canyon storage man. Fully awake around 11, the conversation usually peaked with a passionate discussion of checks and bills. So long as Chris continued making independent films, they'd always be juggling money, thousands here and thousands there. Chris spent time buying or acquiring long-term leases to 3 apartments and 2 houses, which they kept rented at a profit while holing up in rural slums. She kept Sylvère apprised of the status of their mortgages, taxes, rental income, and repair bills. And luckily, beyond this primitive foray into acquisition, with Chris's help, Sylvère's career was becoming lucrative enough to offer the losses incurred by hers. Chris, a die-hard feminist, who often saw herself as spinning on a great Elizabethan wheel of fortune, smiled to think that in order to continue making work, she would have to be supported by her husband. He was independent, Isabelle Hupperd's pimp demanded, spanking her in the back seat of a car in Sauve qui peut. The maid? The bureaucrat? The banker? No! Yeah. In late capitalism, was anyone truly free? Sylvère's fans were mostly young white men drawn to the more transgressive elements of modernism, heroic sciences of human sacrifice and torture, as legitimized by Georges Bataille. They scotch-taped Xeroxes of the famous Torture of 100 Pieces photo from Bataille's Tears of Eros to their notebooks, a regicide captured on gelatin plate film by French anthropologists in China, 1902. The Bataille boys saw beatitude in the victim's agonized expression as the executioner sawed off his last remaining limb. But even more inexcusably, they were often rude to Chris. Going out to exchange ideas with Sylvère Lotringer in bars after his lectures in Paris, Berlin, and Montreal, the boys resented any barrier, especially a wife, and an unseductive one at that, between themselves and the great man. Chris responded by milking money from Sylvère's growing reputation, setting ever higher fees. Would the German money and the $2,000 from Vienna be enough to pay her lab bill in Toronto? No, they'd better hit up Dieter for per diem, etc. Around noon, after coffee number 3, too buzzed to think about anything but money, they hit the phone. Dick's presence in their lives was a vacation from this kind of scheming. It was a foray into scheming of another kind. What is really enchanting in the book is not so much that she's unlikable, and that unlikability is allowed for women, although that's an important point, certainly, but so superficial. What is really, really deeply, deeply, deeply important in this book is that she's not a static character. Lots of people describe this book as being about a triangle, but really, this is a book about female obscurity. White female obscurity, certainly privileged and with access kind of obscurity. It is a moment not only of acceptance of obscurity, but also of discovery of creative fiction. She complains often about this book being the book that she's known for. She recognizes the happiness and the stability in some ways as an author that this book has brought her, but she also is resistant to a specific role that this book may have in feminism. She embraces complexity. In this attitude, for me, there's a real depth of consciousness. And Chris Kraus herself, while she's with us, she's in her 70s now, does everything for this book not to become reduced to a tagline. And so here we're going to go into another moment where she talks about money. And she talks about money in regards to this man she has just met, who is an incredibly savvy and knowledgeable intellectual that she admires greatly. And so they end up talking about her own situation. Back in Columbus, Bill Horrigan, media curator at the Wexner, asked me how I really managed to support myself. I was picking up the restaurant check and driving a new car, and obviously this cover story about an art school teaching job fooled no one. It's simple, I told him. I take money from Sylvère. Was Bill bothered that such a marginal, sexless hag as me wasn't living in the street? Unlike his favorites, Leslie Thornton and Beth B., I was difficult and unadorable and a bad feminist to boot. Oh, Bill, you should have seen me in New York in 1983, vomiting in the street. I was bruised with malnutrition on the Bellevue welfare ward and hooked up to IV, not knowing what was wrong because the city's mandatory catastrophic care plan doesn't cover diagnostic tests. Sylvère and I are Marxists, I told Bill Horrigan. He takes money from the people who won't give me money and gives it to me. Money's abstract, and our culture's distribution of it is based on values I reject, and it occurred to me that I was suffering from the dizziness of contradictions, the only pleasure that remains once you've decided you know better than the world. Accepting contradictions means not believing anymore in the primacy of true feeling. Everything is true and simultaneously. It's why I hate Sam Shepard and all your true West stuff. It's like analysis, as if the riddle could be solved by digging up the buried child. Dear Dick, today I drove across the panhandle of North Texas. I was incredibly excited when I hit the flat land west of Amarillo, knowing that the buried Cadillac piece would come up soon. 10 of them, a pop-up monument to your car, fins flapping, heads buried in the dust. I passed it on the highway, turned back, and took 2 photos of it for you. Dick, you may be wondering, if I'm so wary of the mythology you embrace, why'd my blood start pumping 15 miles west of Amarillo? Why'd I used to get dressed up to go meet J.D. Austin in the Nightbirds bar, so he could fuck me up the arse, then say he didn't love me? Tight jeans, red lips and nails this morning, feeling really femme, and like time for this isn't on my side. It's a cultural study, to be part of something else. Sylvère and I are twinned in our analytic bent, content with scrambling the codes. Oh, Dick, you eroticize what you're not, secretly hoping that the other person knows what you're performing and that they're performing too. Love, Chris. The other aspect of this book is sex, or lack thereof. So the couple, Sylvère and Chris, said to not have had sex for 3 whole years. And Chris Kraus, and this is another thing that makes her highly unlikable, or undesirable and non-identifiable with in this age that we live that is over-sexualized, is that she talks a lot about her lack of libido. And in the previous passage, there is this sort of correlation between this consciousness and this intellectualization of life and of everything around them that might be one of the reasons why they have such a sexless life. And she explains how Dick, regardless of his cowboy nature, or maybe because of it, eroticizes everything. And there's a sort of suggestion of the trap that these men are. And Sylvère, at a certain point, talks about how it sort of pains him to imagine that he is the reflection of all the men that rejected her and the unrequited loves that she may have had in the past before him. And so they are in this connection. They are so bound together. Their work intertwines. She accompanies him to the detriment of herself and also the sort of company that Sylvère has, which is mostly male. And so therefore this sex that she refers to is a complex situation, because one aspect of obscurity is that sex wants visibility. You want to be, and when I say visibility, I don't mean it literally optically in the Rutinian sense. I mean in the sense of being perceived. The introduction of a third element is what prompts Chris and Sylvère to have sex again. Is it because there's someone else? Is it a sort of visibility suddenly because Dick was flirting with her? Why does a man who doesn't really desire you, or perhaps eventually has sex with you but doesn't call you back, flirts with you? And another aspect of sex in this book is that the situation is reversed, and it is the woman who talks about being attracted by someone who is also repulsive. So as you read the letters about Dick, some of the letters become quite aggressive. They become very sarcastic. They are very grating. They're gritty. And so here there's a sort of a reversal, right? Because in instances of sexual assault, to bring something a bit darker and not comical at all into the matter of sex, the reality is that sex is used as an aggression. In that sense, isn't a sexless marriage a proof of love? The explorations of all the sides of the question are very interesting here, not for Chris, her own life, but for us, the readers, because it also allows us not to do the same exercise, not to go about meandering and speculatively live our lives, but maybe to recognize something in there, some form of unavoidable truth. The notion of being a bad feminist was not invented by Phoebe Waller-Bridge in Fleabag, the series that you may have heard of, but really it is something that haunts a lot of feminists. This notion that we are not pure. We're not pure. Our values are not us. And the way we live things and the way our feelings and our emotions lead us into explorative encounters with ourselves and with others is painful. So I will leave you with that. I decided not to reveal the whole book because it is too recent. I prefer to leave you with this other aspect of the book, which is the fact that, and in the last passage I read, there is a reference to an art piece, which is the Cadillacs in the desert. So it's the work of a San Francisco-based art collective of the 70s. It's a 1974 piece, and the collective is called Ant Farm. And so this book is also a subjective exploration of lots of artworks that are part of the 90s inherited art scene from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. It goes deep into a few artists, mostly Hannah Wilke. And Hannah Wilke was an artist, an American artist, who was exploring the feminine identity and who was very criticized at the time. Hannah Wilke was very beautiful and would have been still considered conventionally beautiful. And she based or built partially her work around that beauty. So the last passage that I want to read is about Hannah Wilke. The artist Hannah Wilke was born Arlene Butter in 1940 and grew up in Manhattan and Long Island. She died of cancer at the age of 52. Wilke's output was prolific and consistent. Through constant effort, she maintained a visible career. At a certain point, perhaps the early 70s, her work began addressing the following question. If women have failed to make universal art because we're trapped within the personal, why not universalize the personal and make it the subject of our art? To ask this question, to be willing to live it through, is still so bold. In 1974, after producing drawings, ceramics, and sculptural wall pieces, many of which involved a tough, ambiguous depiction of traditionally female imagery, Douglas Crimp, 1972, for 11 years, Hannah started to insert her own image into her art. I don't know what experiences or conditions in her life precipitated this. Was she pushed towards it by critics such as Phyllis Defner, who wrote responding to her show of cunts fashioned out of washing machine lint at Feldman in 1972? Quote, "There is some wit in this, but it is swamped by aggressive ideology. The ideology is that of women's liberation. Female bodies have been shown, but only in an oppressive, sexist manner. Wilke's forthright, repetitious presentation of the most intimate image of female sexuality is intended to be a cure for all this. I don't see how it is supposed to work. It is boring and superficial." Unquote. Unlike Judy Chicago and her bloated vaginal renditions of great cunts in history, a show that every mother in the world could take her daughters to, Hannah never was afraid to be undignified, to trash herself, to call a cunt a cunt. Quote, "I want to throw back to the audience everything the world throws at me." Unquote. Penny Arcade, 1982. Hannah later told the Soho Weekly News how she'd collected material for this work over several years by doing laundry for Claes Oldenburg, her companion at the time. Even then, Hannah was a neo-Dadaist. Claes Oldenburg, great male universal artist, Shanghaied. In 1974, Wilke made her first videotape, Gestures. Created one day after the death of her sister's husband, Gestures was, among other things, an expression of grief and dismay, a reaching for the body after death. The critic James Collins gave it 2 thumbs up in Art Forum. Quote, "Every time I see her work, I think of pussy." Unquote, he declared. An early champion of Wilke's work, Collins described Gestures thusly, quote, "Erotically, Wilke's video was more successful, hornier than the sculpture. Why? Well, she's actually in it, for a start. The video is probably the best thing in the show because by being in the pieces, using just her head and hands, she gives the folding gestures particularly more meaning. Stroking, kneading, preening, and slapping her face were interesting, but the folding mouth gestures were the naughtiest. Because she's sensuously breaking a cultural rule, and that's one definition of erotic, pushing at her lips and then folding them back, using her mouth as a surrogate vagina and her tongue as a surrogate clitoris, in the context of her face with its whole psychological history, was strong stuff. Wilke's position in the art world is a strange paradox between her own physical beauty and her very serious art. She longs to fulfill her sexuality, but her attempt to deal with this dilemma within the women's movement has a touching air of pathos about it. Unquote. But don't you see, the paradoxes in Hannah Wilke's work are not pathetic, they're polemic. It's like that night, Dick, when you called me passive-aggressive on the phone. Wrong. Gestures throws the weirdness of male response to female sexuality wide open. Meanwhile, Hannah in the work was exploring much more personal and human ground. Quote, Ree Morton told me that when she saw the video, she almost cried. Unquote. Wilke recalled several years later. Quote, I exposed myself beyond posing and she saw past it. She saw the pathos beyond posing. Unquote. From this point on, Hannah willingly became a self-created work of art. In SOS Starification Object Series, from 1974 to 1979, she turns to face the camera in three-quarter profile, bare tits and jeans unzipped with one hand on her crotch. Her eyes are bare and heavy, her long hair set in housewife rollers, obviously a home job. 8 bits of chewed-up gum, shaped to simulate vaginas, are stuck across her face like scars or pimples. Quote, Gum has a shape before you chew it, but when it comes out as real garbage, unquote, she later said. Quote, in this society, we use people up the way we use up chewing gum, unquote. In her presence, Hannah always was extremely beautiful. In 1977, she made another videotape called Intercourse With, in which the answering machine messages left by her boyfriends, friends, and family play as she removes the names of the most troubling, spelled out in press type, from her naked body. Quote, become your own myth, unquote, she started saying. Like every other work of art, Hannah became a piece of roadkill for the art press jackals, torn literally apart. Her naked body straddling interpretations of the hippie man who saw her as an avatar of sexual liberation, and hostile feminists like Lucy Lepard who saw any female self-display as patriarchal putty. Hannah started using the impossibility of her life, her artwork, and career as material. If art's a seismographic project, when that project's met with miscomprehension, failure must become its subject too. In 1976, she produced a poster modeled after the famous School for Visual Arts subway ads that read, quote, having a talent isn't worth much unless you know what to do with it, unquote. Hannah reproduced it with a photo of her fucked up self. Portrait of the artist as an object. She's wearing a crocheted apron that doesn't hide her naked tits at all and clutching a Mickey Mouse doll. The now famous chewing gum vaginas are arranged like tiny scabs across her body. In a later poster called Marxism and Art, Hannah's wearing a man's shirt flung wide open to reveal bare breasts, chewed up cunts, and a white man's tie. Quote, beware of fascist feminism, unquote, the poster reads. From the very start, art critics saw Hannah's willingness to use her body in her work as an act of narcissism. Quote, a harmless air of narcissism pervades this show, unquote, New York Times, 9/20/75. This strange descriptor still follows her beyond the grave, despite the passionate efforts of writers like Amanda Jones and Laura Cottingham to refute it. In his review of Intra-Venus, Hannah's posthumous show, Ralph Rugoff describes the artist's startling photos of her naked cancer-ridden body as a, quote, deeply thrilling venture into narcissism, unquote. As if the only possible reason for a woman to publicly reveal herself could be self-therapeutic. As if the point was not to reveal the circumstances of one's own objectification. As if Hannah Wilke was not brilliantly feeding back her audience's prejudice and fear, inviting them to join her for a naked lunch. A few smart men like Peter Frank and Gerrit Lansing recognized the strategy and wit of Hannah's work, though not perhaps the boldness and the cost. The fact she was a genius. At any rate, the controversy around her work never agglomerated into major stardom. By 1980, Guy Trebay was sniffing in the Village Voice that Hannah's vagina, quote, is now as familiar to us as an old shoe, unquote. Has anybody ever said this about Chris Burden's penis? No one apart from Hannah's closest friends and family recognized the sweetness and idealism at the bottom of her work, her warmth, the humanness of her female person. In an amazing text written in 1976, Hannah proved to be her own best critic. Quote, rearranging the touch of sensuality with the residual magic made from laundry lint or latex loosely laid out like love vulnerably exposed, continually exposing myself to whatever situation occurs, gambling as well as gambling, to exist instead of being an existentialist, to make objects instead of being one, the way my smile just gleams, the way I sip my tea, to be a sugar giver instead of a salt seller, to not sell out. Hannah Wilke Wittgenstein was pure female intellect, her entire gorgeous being stretched out in paradoxical proposition. In 1979, Claes Oldenburg, Hannah's partner since the late 60s, changed their door locks while she was out one day and married someone else. She recreated the collection of 50 ray guns she'd collected for his work and posed naked with them in a series of performalist self-portraits called So Help Me Hannah, in which she demonstrates and overturns her favorite classic citations of male philosophy and art. Hannah Wilke on Ad Reinhardt, sitting naked in a corner, feeling hopeless, head in hands, high-heeled legs apart. She's surrounded by toy pistols and bazookas. What does this represent? What do you represent? The title reads. Hannah Wilke on Karl Marx, posed shakily on the pistons of a combustion engine, in her strappy high-heeled sandals, naked body part of the machine. Hannah lunges forward in profile, toy guns in hand. Exchange values. Exchange values? Whose? The insertion of Hannah Wilke's complex human presence throws all slogans into question. Her beauty is compelling, but as in gestures, her presence circumvents the pose. Quote, I have long since resolved to be a Jew. I regard that as more important than my art. R.B. Kitai and Arnold Schoenberg declared. Hannah Wilke said, feminism, in a larger sense, is intrinsically more important to me than art. Unquote. No one ever called these men bad Jews. The bitterest irony of Hannah Wilke's career is that her imitators who risked much less became art stars of the early 80s. Quote, Wilke's projection of herself contrasts markedly with the more impersonal impersonations of the recent work of Cindy Sherman, whose dress-up masquerades are, au fond, no less narcissistic, but somehow easier to accept or digest as art because they disguise the self and parody the suffering, pain and pleasure we sense in Wilke's art, Lowery Sims argued, in a new museum catalogue in 1984. But by then, art history had already labelled Wilke dumb, her imitators smart. And a bit later on, quote, because we rejected a certain kind of theoretical language, people just assumed that we were dumb, unquote, the poet Alice Notley said to me in Paris last year. Hannah Wilke spent a great deal of energy throughout her life trying to prove that she was right. If art's a seismographic project, then that project meets with failure. Failure must become a subject too. Dear Dick, that's what I realized when I fell in love with you. Quote, of course Hannah did become a monster, unquote, I said to Warren Nieluzowski. Warren's a friend, an art-world personality and critic, a smart and cultivated guy. We were sitting on Mike Kelly's patio at a barbecue catching up on news. Warren knows everyone in the art world. He'd known Hannah since they met in 1975 at the Soho restaurant Food. Warren chuckled. Quote, yes, she did, but of the wrong kind, not a monster on the order of Picasso or, and here he named several other famous males. The problem was she started taking everything so personally. She refused to take a leap of faith. Her work was no longer art, unquote. In 1985, Claes Oldenburg threatened an injunction against the University of Missouri Press. They were preparing a book of Hannah Wilke's work and writings to accompany her first major retrospective. In order to protect his privacy, Claes Oldenburg demanded that the following items be removed. 1. A photograph from advertisements for living that depicted Claes together with Hannah's 8-year-old niece. 2. Any mention of his name in Hannah's writings. 3. Reproduction of a collaborative poster, Artists Make Toys. 4. Quotations from a correspondence between him and Hannah that was part of Hannah Wilke's text, I object. Claes's fame and the university's unwillingness to defend her made it possible for Oldenburg to erase a huge portion of Hannah Wilke's life. Erase her, the title of one of Wilke's later works. I explained to Warren about the difference between male and female monsters. Quote, female monsters take things as personally as they really are. They study facts. Even if rejection makes them feel like the girl who's not invited to the party, they have to understand the reason why, unquote. Monstrosity, the self as a machine, the blob, mindlessly swallowing and engorging, rolling down the supermarket aisle, absorbing pancake mix and jello and everyone in town. Unwise and unstoppable. The horror of the blob is a horror of the fearless. To become the blob requires a certain force of will. Every question, once it's formulated, is a paradigm, contains its own internal truth. We have to stop diverting ourselves with false questions. And I told Warren, I aim to be a female monster too. Love, Chris. What else is there to say? The only thing I can tell you is that after reading I Love Dick, the only thing left to do is to start Lauren Elkin's book, Art Monsters. You will not be disappointed. Non-binaries, females, males, intersex people, everyone should read it. Trans people, everyone. It's a really interesting book about visibility as well, and visibility particularly of female identifying people, but also I think extended to anyone who doesn't have the expectations of society to be something that is perceived as something. And speaking of thing, in the case of Chris Kraus, but also in the case of Sophie Calle, for example, obscurity led to exposure. A female making art, exposing themselves, doesn't really matter. No one is shocked, especially when the female in question is not beautiful like Hannah Wilke. And that's why Chris Kraus's analysis is so interesting and so powerful of Hannah Wilke's work. So writing I Love Dick was a risk because Sylvère Lotringer was famous. So this could have been damaging. It could have been a scandal because there's a suggestion of an autobiographical basis. But there's also Sylvère's behavior in the book, because if it was indeed true, and if these letters were indeed signed by Sylvère, it means that this game truly happened. And it was ridiculous, exposing, unserious, unphilosophical, everything that Sylvère wasn't. So Sylvère is really an accomplice here. Can we call him an ally? Maybe. And also, similarly, Sophie Calle overturned the power structure between the muse and the writer by being unattractive but intelligent, and by not caring to expose herself as such. So obscurity through exposure might be true freedom, because for those who are watching, what do you really know of the person exposed? What do you know about me seeing my office, seeing my clothes, seeing my plants, my face? Nothing really, except projections, and those by definition live on surfaces. So Chris Kraus took a gamble with this book that shifted her career because indeed she stopped being a filmmaker and she became an author and dedicated her life to writing. So once you have achieved this platform of visibility, is it a hurdle for creativity? I think this book also talks about this in What It Became and how Chris Kraus then handled her career and the fact that she's not keen on being in a platform that embraces things through a superficial lens based on taglines and onliners says a lot about how she manages exposure. So if you are between peers, which is what Sylvère Lotringer was as well, and something that maybe people who are outside of the game played by the white males or the males in general, maybe that's also something to aspire to, having your own group, your own community. And Chris Kraus's posterior work very much focused on female artists, on really maintaining those friendships and talking about imperfect women such as Kathy Acker, whose biography she recently wrote. So exposure is something to be managed. Creative freedom is something that is never an absolute. It is also and always negotiable. And although Chris Kraus claims not to be of philosophy, she certainly is a critical thinker. And I will only leave you with one little nugget from Chris Kraus. In an interview, she explained that she has nothing against philosophy. She worked for a publishing house that published philosophical books, semiotext. What she really is against is this obligation of bringing philosophy into art and bringing philosophical terms into art, and not, for some mysterious reason, being allowed to tackle art and to embrace art through writing, through experience, and not tackle art in other ways, specifically through experience and personal subjective relationship with it. Why is it frowned upon? And I not only agree with her, I also think that everything has its place. It doesn't mean that we are against philosophy. She does talk about philosophy in the book, and very well, and maybe better than those gatekeepers. The thing really is to not forbid any kind of relationship with art and to place in a hierarchical order philosophy at the top and experience and subjectivity at the bottom. Neutrality does not exist, and it is usually the tone that is given by the gatekeepers, because we are all subjective. We're all people with a history. So I'll leave you with that. And if you have other suggestions of books that I could read, they're very welcome. Other than that, go to the show's notes. There's links in there, and there's also links for you to donate, to subscribe to the newsletter. Keep informed, and you will also receive texts if you like reading, because that newsletter is in my online publication where you get all the other things, all the good stuff that I do. All right, take care. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.